today we have a chance to, in this community conversation, take an even further step back from the work that we're doing today to deep dive into the issue of digital inequity. And as I think many of us at least, have seen in the past year, the digital divide has been in headlines and has become much more visible as students and educators and community members, particularly low-income communities, have been cut off from education and healthcare and employment opportunities and really our world in the course of the pandemic. But as the practitioners that are joining me today know and will tell you, this is not a new challenge, and the digital divide was born with technology. And our most optimistic statistics put about 30% of low-income and rural communities on the wrong side of the digital divide. And so we have three folks who have been doing this work for a really long time, who have been looking at the scope of the challenge and fighting for digital inclusion, and are here to share with this very large room of folks that want to make something happen about it and want to contribute a chance to do so and a chance to understand more. So thank you so much, Angela and Latricia and Dan, for being with us today, and eager to stop talking and let you start, and would love to start with a round of introductions. And Latricia, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Danielle. And just thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And I too am inspired by Skills for Cities, and this is my first time getting a chance to be a part of this. So looking more for other opportunities like this. So as Danielle mentioned, my name is Latricia Boone. I am Vice President of the Equality of Opportunity Initiative at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The Equality of Opportunity Initiative is really a historic endeavor by the Chamber. We were launched in 2020, coming out of a lot that was going on in our country. And so in the midst of a global pandemic, racial awakening globally, really, the Chamber brought together this initiative to think about how the business community, to think and act on how the business community can not only help lead around many of the inequities that we have seen systemically, but also be in partnership with community, with others. And our focus is on what are the ways that the private sector can discuss and bring solutions forward, but also how can we work with the public sector, so policymakers and others, to ensure that we are actually making change and advancing solutions at all levels that are going to help close race-based opportunity gaps. And I'll just say really quickly, our focus is around education, employment, entrepreneurship, criminal justice, health, and wealth. When you think about digital inclusion, that touches all of those pieces of our work. And so my excitement for this conversation is because we are out on the front lines in many ways, working with over 500 state and local chambers across the country, businesses that are part of our chamber network, and others to try to close those race-based opportunity gaps. But I know that we won't have the impact that we are looking to have in those areas, whether it be education, whether it be entrepreneurship or health and wealth, if we are not able to solve issues around digital inclusion. So very excited to be with this esteemed panel and talk more about the work that the chamber is doing in this space.
Thank you so much, Latricia. Great to have you here today. Angela, how about you?
Hi everyone. Thanks for having me, Danielle. Angela Siefer, Executive Director, National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I live in Columbus, Ohio. We got NDIA started about 7 years ago because there wasn't an entity that represented digital inclusion programs on the ground. As you're going to hear from Dan very shortly, TeCos Home is a great example of a program. His is a full organization. In other places, it is a program inside a larger organization that's working on equitable access to the internet, to devices, the digital literacy skills, the tech support, everything that one needs to participate today. So NDIA's role is to support organizations like TeCos Home in the work that they do, but then also to hear what they're saying in order to be able to take that message, those lessons learned, the expertise to the policymakers to make sure that any resources or policies that are out there, or we try anyhow, that they are reflective of the knowledge on the ground and are really helpful and not a hindrance.
Thank you, Angela. Dan?
And you succeed is what we should say. So my name is Dan Noyes. I'm the co-CEO of TeCos Home, which is a Boston-based, Massachusetts-based nonprofit. And I think everyone here knows that digital inequities pose huge barriers for millions of students and families and adults and older adults and everyone. And it also has a terribly disproportionate impact on communities of color. And I think this is a very important point that needs to be talked about more, is that digital exclusion is part of this system that was set up that has resulted in generations of people falling behind because of racism and social injustice. So we're, as an organization, committed to bringing digital inclusion to open up access to and empower our communities to access essential resources and education and healthcare and the economy and everything, even to the census. Make sure that people are able to access those items. And just from a very logistical point of view, we provide computers, internet access, and training to those that need it. And our hope is that this does bring about more equity. And in terms of who we serve, 90% of the people we serve are considered very low income by HUD. That's an actual term, and about 60% are extreme low income. 85% are from communities of color. 2/3 identify as women, 50% immigrants, and shockingly still, 35% of the adults we serve are unemployed. And a quick note, one of the original questions that we had bandied about was, what makes this personal for you? And I spent about 10 years working in Boston public schools, and Boston's very lucky that it has lots of wealth and lots of resources, and so kids would have amazing technology in the school, and yet they'd go home and have nothing. And it was incredibly frustrating as an educator, because anyone knows that you need to have 24-hour learning going on, and when you have that disruption at home, it really hinders achievement. So it made it very personal for me, and it's why I do what I do.
Thank you so much. And I know it's personal to all of you. You all have been in this work for a really long time. And Angela, you've been in digital inclusion work for more than a decade, even longer than that. And you are kind to not roll your eyes at those of us who are just awakening to the gravity of this challenge. Can you share with us what this landscape looks like, how it has changed, and what happened in the past 18 months to kind of awaken the world to it?
Yeah, so I got involved in all this when I was in grad school, and we asked local organizations what kind of support they needed from the university. And one of the top answers that came back was technology with their constituents. And so the idea that the folks that they were serving, they wanted to be able to use technology with them, and then they couldn't. And back then I was helping set up community labs. So this is about 25 years ago. We're setting up public computer labs. And if we had one computer connected to the internet, we were like, oh, this is great. Because really what we wanted was people to get to use the computer to create a resume, right? To learn some keyboarding skills, right? It wasn't, how we use technology influences what we think of as the digital divide. I think an unfortunate reality is that we may never, when we use the term digital divide, we may never solve or bridge the digital divide. We're going to make gains in different aspects of it. So today we don't think about it as just keyboarding skills, of course, or being able to write up your resume on Microsoft Word. We think about it more as all the possibilities, and then it impacts that you can't even, people talk about surviving or thriving, right? You're not going to thrive if you can't barely survive with the particular access that you have to the internet or the skills that you have. So that's really changed over time. And then when the pandemic hit, there was this great awareness that developed about the need for all of these things. I think during the pandemic, though, there was a big focus on kids and youth, but we all know that they don't live alone. They have adults in their lives, and everybody needs the support, including, the grandparents. And so the shift has been in the awareness, but we're still shifting, I think, and even terminology. When we say the term digital divide, what do we mean? For some folks, it means availability of the internet. And that is limiting. It's not just about availability of the internet. In urban areas, we have availability of the internet, but folks aren't subscribing or using it to the ability, to fully thrive in life. And so those are still divides out there. And so we have to really look at the use, not just the availability of it. So I think the shift has been over time since we first started calling things digital divide. But then also the shift has been during the pandemic when the awareness happened. So within NDIA, we often talk about this being digital equity's moment. Right, we have people's attention. Quick! We have to figure out how to make some great strides, and I do think that is happening in some local communities. It's not happening in all local communities, and we are seeing possibility with the federal government. Like everybody, cross fingers and toes that infrastructure bill passes, because that's the thing that's the funding that's needed by folks like TeCos Home to be able to do their work. There really hasn't been money for this prior to the pandemic. There was a lot of struggling. So there's been a lot of shifting, but I actually am pretty hopeful.
Well, it's excellent to hear you say that. And we have people's attention right now. We certainly have the business community's attention. And I think that can be a really powerful force if channeled effectively. And Latricia, I know that is work that you do day in and day out. And in our conversations, you have often talked about the need to underscore the business imperative, the economic imperative, because there really is one here. And so would be curious to hear what that means to you, the work that you do every day, what you're seeing from the companies that you partner with.
Yeah, thank you so much. And let me just hoorah to what Angela said, because I remember even before coming to the Chamber. So as much as I've not worked on digital specifically or alone for many years, I have worked on equity and racial equity issues and opportunity gaps and all those things for many years. And I remember being at the National Urban League and the conversation, we talked a lot about availability and those things. And now I have seen shifts, and I particularly, as coming to now the U.S. Chamber, seen how the business community is even speaking about it differently, because I was at Urban League and in conversations with business and we were speaking differently. And so, I know folks talk about the pandemic and there's been a lot of not so good spots, but the bright spots are that it's opened our eyes to a lot of things. So when you think about where the business community is, in the work that I do at the Chamber, we recognize that this global pandemic has really exacerbated existing inequities across the board, and it's created a lot of spiraling effects. And so, when we think about the facets of our lives, whether it's health or work or employment or education or businesses, digital equity is truly important. We talk a lot, we partner in this work with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and we talk a lot about closing the racial equity gaps would, bring about, I think it's like 8 trillion in GDP to our US economy. And that's huge. For the work that we do, our companies that we work with are recognizing and continuing to recognize that when we think about digital inequity and how it's impacting communities, underserved communities, communities of color, to Dan's point, but in rural communities, of course, we know that it is impacting what our companies are doing. We have a worker shortage. Folks don't, have access or have the ability to adopt or no availability or even the training or understanding. And so organizations like TeCos Home are really important and critical to the business community, because it opens up space for folks to get the training they need, to have access. I'm talking through a lot of things because the Chamber is doing so much and our companies are in so many spaces. We work with companies who are in the health space. When you're talking about folks telehealth and getting access to the appropriate health care, we cannot provide those services if we don't have the right availability and inclusion in communities among those that we are working with and serving. And so from the perspective of our initiative around equality of opportunity, we have several task forces. We have a steering committee where we're coming together with the business community to talk about their needs. And I have not been in any conversation where someone has said, oh, this is not an imperative, because they recognize that it's an economic imperative for a number of different reasons, such as some that I just mentioned. But I think what's becoming to be different about these conversations, and what to me has presented an opportunity, is we're also recognizing through this work that it's not just about us being in a room and having a conversation. It's around how do we bring the voices and perspectives of those who are impacted in this space to those conversations, so that we are also centering their experiences, and that business is seeing the value for themselves, but also seeing how they can have greater impact in the communities where their employees work and where they are servicing folks. So I say all that to say it's truly a business imperative. We recognize it. And I'm going to also second Angela on this bipartisan infrastructure bill and the passage of it. We at the Chamber are very supportive of it. From a policy perspective, there's a lot that we're doing, but that is one space where we recognize there's lots of opportunities in this work as we think about digital inequity and closing some of the gaps that are currently existing.
Thank you, Latricia. And I think policy is one of our biggest levers within digital inclusion, and will, in a lot of ways, enable other sectors to follow suit and to bring their power behind that. And while we're on that topic, Angela, I would love for you to share. I know that NDIA has just released a couple of policy priorities. I would love for you to share. I know we could talk about this for 3 hours, but if you could just give us the headlines on what policy initiatives you think are important and how that's impacting this issue.
Yeah, sure. So we just recently released our policy priorities, and I put the link in the chat. We put them into 6 key areas. And so the first one is affordable, right? A lot of the internet service, most of the internet service in the United States is not affordable. And so being affordable probably means a subsidy, but it also means encouraging the providers, however we need to encourage them, to have discount offers that are really valuable and affordable. The next one is to fund and support community-based digital inclusion programs. So digital inclusion programs that are local are the folks that are trusted. And so we really think we can't just be like, well, and this goes also to companies, don't just fund a national organization as a national organization saying this, right? Fund the folks that are on the ground, fund the TeCos Homes, because those are the ones that are really working these programs on the ground. And then the third one is that we need to fund and invest in progressive digital skills pathways. Everybody needs something different in life. None of us are ever done learning. Technology's never done changing, as much as that may kill us all. It is never done changing. So we have to be able to always have a way, someone to turn to keep up with that. The fourth one is devices. We have to make sure everyone has the right device for their task, because lots of folks are just using a mobile phone to get by, and that is cannot thrive with a mobile phone. And then data. We need better data. There's a lot of talk generally about broadband availability data, but we also need cost data, right? And we need more specific data about who's paying what and when they drop off service, and mobile versus wireline kinds of questions. And then our sixth one is about the equitable deployment. So there's a lot of money probably coming for broadband deployment, and it will be disseminated and distributed in a variety of ways, but making sure that all residents have access. So if the government, and this has already happened, has built networks with federal monies, and then low-income households can't afford it, it's only for those who have money who can afford that $70 bill. Is that a good use of federal money? So that's the equity piece of it. So for us, the policy priorities really come down to thinking about what does it mean when we say equity? And a great example is, well, we could use federal money to build a network, but who really has access to that network? I mean, theoretically, it's everybody, but come on, $70, $80 a month, it's not everybody. So when we think about the potential coming up, the infrastructure bill, everything else that is happening right now in Congress, this is the shift that we need. It's not a permanent shift, and it's really only a start, because it will be just as the funding that we've already had so far. It's stimulus funds, right? And this is going to be a one-time injection, and that's going to be amazing, and it's going to help a lot of things get moving, but it's not the end solution. We need the sustainable sources of funding, and we need systemic kind of change to where each community has a robust digital inclusion ecosystem, and everybody knows who's doing what, and you know where to get a low-cost computer, and you know who's providing tech support, and you know where to go for digital literacy training, no matter the language or the cultural realities that you are in. That's the shift, and that's going to take some time. And for us to think clearly that as technology keeps changing, we have to keep adjusting. And as we learn better how to help folks, we'll keep adjusting. So we're in this for the long term. So when folks say something to you about bridging the digital divide and solving this, figure out a more polite way to roll your eyes at them and help them understand that this is more of a long-term problem.
Sorry, I was on mute. I had some canine excitement earlier, so I paused myself. And to your point, we might never bridge it, but we have to figure out the different pieces to tackle. Angela, when you talk about the infrastructure that we need, who do you think is best designed to create that infrastructure? Is that a cross sector? Is that a private sector? Is that public?
Yeah, the way we've started talking about it is that it needs to be infrastructure that's accountable to the local residents. So it doesn't matter really who owns it in our regard, like if it's locally owned or if it's owned elsewhere, but if the entity providing that broadband service is accountable to the local community. And that can happen in a variety of ways. It can happen because it really is like your neighbor owns the broadband service. And so you're going to harass them if it's not what your community needs. There's that kind of accountable, but there's also accountable where the companies really are hearing what's needed in the different communities and engaged in the solutions. That is possible. We're going to have to press to make that more of a reality than it currently is, but it is possible.
Excellent. So Dan, bring us on the ground here. TeCos Home is one of the local organizations that Angela is talking about that does this work every day. And as you talked about the demographic of the folks that you serve earlier, the very and extremely low income, it calls to mind this concept of the K-shaped recovery from the pandemic, right? That those who have privilege are going to bounce back and potentially be in even stronger positions than they were before. And those that were in low-income communities and BIPOC communities have suffered for the long term, right? And not only will they not go back to where they were before, but they're probably worse for the wear. And for students who had to leave school, they might not be going back for all the systemic reasons that surround those issues. And so would be curious what that looks like on the ground for you. Bring us into how TeCos Home serves clients and what you're seeing there in terms of recovery.
Thank you for the question. And I mean, my opinion is that the system was set up to recover like that. Like it was really set up so that people at the top would recover fastest. So when we say the system is broken, it's not. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. We need a new system. That's what we need. We need something that doesn't do that anymore. And just on the ground, I mean, I mentioned earlier that the unemployment rate among our learners is in the mid 30s. Well, at the height of the pandemic, it was approaching 50%. Because so many of our learners are restaurant workers and construction workers and the people who clean the office buildings that are even now still closed. I think just so many people immediately lost resources that were scarce to begin with. And now it just got so much worse. Here's an example. I think healthcare is a really good example right now of where we're seeing it's significantly unequal in its recovery, and in that, if you are a white senior, you are twice as likely to have access to telemedicine than if you're a Black senior, and almost 3 times as likely if you're a Latin senior. Well, if you look at data and it says, well, who is most likely to end up in the hospital with COVID? Well, it's Black and Latin seniors. And there's just no surprise to this. And then this is, I love where I'm from, but Massachusetts, when they rolled out the vaccine, in the beginning, the only way you could get a vaccine appointment was online. 41% of people who are on Medicare don't have a computer or internet at home. So it's just like it was done that way, and it wasn't intentional by anyone. It's just, this is the system. It's just like, let's go with this approach. And I think we saw this with education too, that when everything went virtual, it was a good solution for a good chunk of people. But what about the 35 to 40% of people that can't do that because mom has to go to work, so the teenager has to watch the baby at home, or whatever the situation is? And I don't want to dampen the conversation, but I've yet to see in all of this recovery real attempts to get us truly better than we were before the pandemic, because for so many people it was terrible before the pandemic. So I feel like we need a new system that I don't have that solution. I'll be right up front. Like I'm not nearly smart enough to come up with a solution. I just can see from the people we're serving and the communities that we're working with that it wasn't working before. It's not working now. We need something new so it works. It does eventually work later.
So dive into what's working and what's not, right? Or I think sometimes easier is what's not, what is broken. And we have right now in this conversation, nearly 200 people who are interested in making change or interested in being part of the solution. And a lot of them are from companies. And so I talk about how companies, how corporate employees can play a role, what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. And
Sure.
I say be honest, right? This is the conversation to dive into that.
I'm definitely honest, maybe a little too honest at times. Angela chides me all the time. I think there's a lot of things that people can do, and there are things that are definitely working well. I think Angela's comment about data is a really good one, is that for so long, the way we collect data about information has had such an incredible bias, a racial bias. When you start thinking about who answers surveys, it's pretty obvious that you're not going to get representation from groups that are not being served. So when you start making policy decisions and money decisions based on surveys with bad data, it's not a recipe for success. So I think that's positive. The reason it's positive, I think those conversations are happening now about how do we get at better data. I think that the fact that there's been so much focus on community-centric solutions, I think is also really good. I think that's a definite step in the right direction. It's just like, I'm familiar with where I serve, but if I go to San Antonio, Texas and say, hi, I'm TeCos Home, I have the solution for you, that's ridiculous. Like, I don't know San Antonio, Texas. I don't know the communities there. I don't know those, people who work there. An example of something I think in the policy side that we need to change, the good news is money is being poured into broadband opportunities. And I think that's amazing for people. However, the money is still going to the corporations that are out there, not providing necessarily the resources that they need to provide. So it's about figuring out how can we do both at the same time. So I guess what I would say is to people who are in corporations, and people working in this group, is when thinking about how your company does the work it does, how is it involving the communities that you're in, and how is it involve the communities that you're serving? And I think the more we can have those community-centric conversations, the better off we'll all be in the end.
And if I could just add to that, Danielle, I really like what Dan is saying about those community conversations and community connectedness. And I think it's important too for corporations and probably some of the folks who are on this call to recognize that they oftentimes do have those connection points. It's a conversation we're often having internally around a corporation, in a room where we're talking about things. To be quite honest, even when I talk about our Equality of Opportunity Steering Committee, we might have the vice president of this or someone who's in a higher level leadership position, but sometimes we forget that we have employees who are working in those communities, who have relatives or family or friends in communities, and we don't always access their perspective, their opinions, their lived experiences as an opportunity to add value to the work that we're doing. And so, again, we could have some of those folks on the call. And if that is you, you are a leader in your own right. And how do you work through your company to help bring perspective and help give access to a community? Because there's also a piece around trust. And when we want to go in community and work with folks, we may have all the best intentions, but if there's not a trust factor there, it could also go awry and we can't have the impact that we want to have. And so I just say, as we are working with companies, I mean, it's a part of the work that I do. I'm always trying to understand, okay, beyond the senior vice president of what X, Y, and Z, who in your company is also connected. I'll give a really quick example. We were highlighting our, we have an event that we do annually, and I say that because we've only done it twice, but it's anticipated to be annual. It's called our National Summit on Equality of Opportunity, and we were trying to think about highlighting, some best practices, examples on a corporate side of what companies are doing beyond just making financial commitments. We know folks are doing that. It's important. People need investment, but how are we actually leaning into that? And I remember meeting with the Discover CEO about work that they were doing in Chicago and how they opened this call center in Chicago in a community that had been dilapidated, neglected, and really thinking through how, and it relates to digital inequity because they were hiring from that community, but instead of saying, oh, go online and find the job, they were like bringing tech to that community to help people understand, how do I apply for the job, offering training. They turned the actual physical location that they took a Target and turned it into the new call center, but they made it a community hub. And I share that story because I thought it was such a great example of how, instead of them just pouring money into that community or saying, we're going to do this, they went into community, and the employees, folks they were hiring, but also the employees who were on staff, created that connection point to that community for them. So.
Well, and I think it's connected to something that we've all talked about, which is corporate engagement and philanthropy in the pandemic moved towards a really positive place of trusting the community and trusting the organizations to do what they needed to do in real time, right? And so, like, we saw a release of grant restrictions and here's funding, go forth. And in a lot of ways, that is a model that we need to get to. And I, in kind of a Pollyanna tone, said, hopefully we can hang on to that. And Dan kindly said, well, I don't think we are. And already starting to see some boomerang back to that. So I think part of this is figuring out those micro moments or those partnerships where we, particularly folks from companies who hold the power in those relationships, can communicate and build those trusted relationships. And Angela, would be curious for your take on this question of trust, how that's built and how that's built authentically, because I know when Common Impact was exploring earlier this year how we could support digital inclusion more effectively, one of the key things that came up in our conversations around that was that the folks that need digital access and tech access often don't trust companies. How do we start to build that trust, bridge that divide?
Yeah, well, in particular, during the pandemic, there was really fabulous effort by philanthropy and corporations and internet service providers and the government to pay for somebody's internet service. So we had situations where internet service was being covered. People were saying no to free internet. We had to figure out, why are people saying no to free internet? And one of the dominant reasons is trust. Right. I don't trust the internet service provider because they might be charging me $10 now, but they're going to charge me $70 next month. And they call this a promotional offer. So forget it. You're not scamming me. Right. Like they've been through down this path before. Folks who live in poverty have lived lives where, trust is an issue. So there's that piece of it. There's also the government piece of it. Do we trust the government? No. Why would you trust the government? So of course I don't trust the government. Why does that surprise any of us? None of us trust the government. So the trust piece is it has to do with how the services are rolled out and NDIA has been encouraging is that the local organizations that really already have that trust through some other means, maybe it's a food program, maybe it's a, other kind of skills program, maybe it's whatever, but they already have that trusted relationship for some other reason, and to engage those organizations in the solutions. And I think this is probably true for a variety of issues when dealing with households that are struggling with poverty. But the trust piece is one where we all have to address it. And it's one of the reasons that we encourage corporations to not just throw money at a national organization that claims that they're going to bridge the digital divide, because that's probably not going to happen, because that trust piece is so local that you have to involve the folks who are on the ground. And there's often, because it's technology and it's broadband service, there can be complications with local service like digital redlining. And if you're not in that community, you don't know the certain neighborhoods have been digitally redlined, and that certain neighborhoods only have access to, and certain streets even only have about 3 meg from one provider, and maybe faster from another provider, but essentially monopolies. But you don't know that because you're not in that community to understand that kind of level of detail. And again, the data, the map that's out there, that will only tell you to a certain point if you're not local, or to know that a certain provider is not trusted by a certain group of folks for whatever reason. But those are very local, that's local knowledge that one has to take into account.
If I could just give an example of that, Danielle, just on the ground example. So anyone who takes one of our courses, they get the computer, but if they need it, we offer them a year of internet for free. And we give people 2 options. We give one from a big ISP where you sign up, and we actually encourage people to take that one because it's more secure, it's more stable, it's faster. The second option is just one of those hockey pucks hotspots. That is okay, it's inconsistent, it depends on where you live in the building, and the speeds are slower. By nearly 20 to 1, our learners take the substandard hotspot. And I don't have all the answers to why that is. I know I second everything Angela says, but it's the trust issue is huge. It's the next part of that sentence that I'm struggling with, is what's the solution? Because I don't have it yet. When the best powerful internet in your community is provided by 1 or 2 places and that's it, and those 1 or 2 places don't have the trust of the community that you want to get to that great powerful internet, I don't see the solution yet. But I see the problem. I'm looking for the solution. So if anyone here wants to take a stab at it, I'd love that.
I'm curious, Dan. Oh, go ahead, Angela.
Just that I think that's part of our need moving forward, that we do need to understand at a deeper level. And now that we have folks' attention, there could be resources to help understand at a deeper level, right? So research, we need the research to figure out why, and I can sit here and make up a bunch of guesses, and half will be right and half will be wrong, right? So like, we really need folks to kind of dive in, and what's the specifics around trust, plus what are the other issues, what's related to housing insecurity, like what are all the other issues in somebody else's life that leads to that. So I think this is our moment to get folks to really help us with those big answers, and that the households that are the hardest to reach, we can't just be like, well, we hit whatever percent, 90%, good to go. No, let's dive in.
Well, and one of the things that we haven't touched on yet, and is a big part of this issue in my mind, is equity in the tech industry, right? Tech companies and technology departments at companies tend to be really homogenous. White men are usually the folks that have the design jobs and the decision-making jobs, while communities of color are in technician jobs and lower level, less decision-making roles. Women are incredibly underrepresented. So when you talk to folks like Tarika Barrett, who runs Girls Who Code, or Catherine Racy, who runs the Tech Equity Collaborative, they'll say that part of where this starts is in diversity, equity, and inclusion within the tech industry. So would love to hear your perspective on that, if you're seeing any change there and what companies might be able to do.
Yeah, I'm a little quiet. I don't know if others.
Good luck with that one.
I will say this, through our work, again, my work is kind of like broadly in this space. And so it's not just about digital and tech, it's about how are we closing gaps across a number of different things, which also can be overwhelming at times. But I will say that we have had a focus on STEM careers more specifically, which obviously tech falls into that, and how we can help to bring more diversity in those spaces, because we recognize that to some of the things that we've heard already, right? Representation matters. And even to the point of the person that I'm speaking with or who's engaging with me, if there's some division there, I'm less likely to trust them. And not that I'm going to trust every Black woman that I'm working with because I identify as a Black woman, but it does help in some spaces. I think someone put in the chat around an African-American owned internet and cell phone communications company and this phenomenal story that the CEO has. And I'd be curious to know in that particular community if they're seeing some uptick in folks working with or doing business with this company, just because maybe, again, representation does matter. And when we talk about diverse pathways, we have a program called Next Gen Business. We are doing just that. We work with historically Black colleges and universities. Tech is a huge piece of this, and we are trying to help. And it's a slow process, just like everything else, because nothing happens overnight, especially nothing impactful, but trying to help change the face of the industry. And I will even say, as a mom of a young woman who is in the tech industry, my daughter works for an app company, so I'm kind of sharing my own personal story. It's interesting even hearing and talking to her, because it's one thing to get into the tech industry. She participated in Girls Who Code. She participated in a Microsoft program really young, very interested. She's now there, and the lack of supports that can be available. And I'm somewhat equipped, again, as a Black woman who's had my own corporate story, but there's a lot of nuance to the experiences she's having and what she's seeing, and even her growth and other things. So I say all that to say that is a tough one. I'm going to echo Dan in that I don't know that I have all the answers, but I believe it is very important. And I think when we talk about digital inequity, we are not going to be able to even get close to closing some of those gaps if we don't think about representation and what that means. And lived experiences, having folks in those spaces who at the decision-making tables who can help bring the perspectives of what's happening in community and why, folks are not feeling like they can trust, or even just, understanding what their experiences are and how they process things, and so that we can understand, if this is where they go get this kind of support, maybe we should be working through this community organization, or maybe this is the space we should be. All of those things make a difference when we talk about diversity at a decision-making table.
So we have just a couple minutes that remain, and I feel like you all have shared a lot of solutions, actually. A lot of the programming and the work that you're doing on the ground, and a lot of what are the, not Band-Aids, but the work that's going to solve the immediate needs, and then some that's going to address the more systemic challenges. But it is larger than this conversation could be, or than any one organization. But thank you so much for the education that you've provided to us today. As we wrap up with our last couple minutes, would love to just go around and hear from you, your parting words, what you want to leave this group of folks with, and when they're thinking about digital inclusion and how they can support. And Angela, we can start with you.
We have a lot on the NDIA website, so digitalinclusion.org. I welcome everyone to join our community. It is really a community. Folks share with each other, and we do a lot of community building so that that's real. So I welcome folks to the website. I welcome them to click the join button. It's free, because that's how getting at some of those more granular barriers and then the more creative solutions is going to be all of us working together. And that's the value of the community.
Dan, what would you say?
I would just say, find a cause that you can give your heart and mind to. I mean, obviously for me, it was this issue of equity, specifically digital equity, but find a cause that resonates with you and stick with it, and, go beyond just the painting of a wall or the one-time event. I think once you do that, you'll realize that the impact that you as an individual can have. So that's what I would say.
Latricia.
Yeah, I would say definitely, I hope that, you took a nugget from this conversation. And if you could take that back to your spaces, share with colleagues, share with others in your company, I think it's important that the more folks understand the issues and they can speak to them. And also, sometimes it can be hard, but just really make a commitment to be a voice and someone who's also putting into action. And so, taking what you learn here, even if it's just a nugget, back and sharing it and helping to educate others. But if you are in spaces where you can bring some of your own experiences, speak up, or help to center the experiences of others in those spaces, I would ask you to do so. I think from the perspective of the work that I do at the Chamber, we're oftentimes speaking at this very high level, and it is never lost on me that the voices and perspectives of those who are not in that room are just as important as the ones in that room. So as much as you can help bring that, I try to do that in my everyday job and just encourage folks to do that as well. And get engaged for sure. The organizations that are on this panel are doing the work. And so if you can find ways to engage, would welcome you to be a part of that.
Hear, hear. And I think that's so much of what this day is about. So I would encourage you to think about who you have met today, who you worked with today, what you learned today, and to share that out. And we had to fit a lot of big topics into a small amount of time in this conversation. And so didn't get to engage you all in the way that we would have ideally loved to if we had all day, but really encourage you to keep the conversation active in the chat, to reach out to us, to connect with the folks that you heard from in the past hour and in the course of the day to keep the conversation going.